The question and answer later, but I will just say that she is without question one of the most distinguished, thoughtful, and influential economists operating in Japan today. I don't think I need to tell this audience that her ideas on Abenomics, or her ideas on Womenomics rather, have become a core part of the Abenomics agenda. Had, I think, tremendous influence both on the Prime Minister's thinking, but more generally on the direction that Japan is trying to pursue in taking greater advantage of the for the Japanese economy that its women provide if they were given greater opportunity to do so. Of course, today we're also looking forward to hearing Kathy's thoughts more broadly on Abenomics. Japanese economy. So without further ado, let me welcome Kathy to the stage.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to guess because it's bloody hot outside, you've come here because you want to seek respite from the heat and humidity. I'm very pleased and delighted to be here with you today. Some of you, I see good friends. For those of you who've never seen me before, I am a native of California. Any Californians here? Hey! My parents, though, are immigrants from Nara-ken. My father is a farmer. My father has changed his crop. He just turned 80 this year. He has a 70-acre farm in Salinas Valley of California. And I'm proud to say my dad is coming in a few days, but he is the #1 orchid grower in America, 20% market share. So I grew up on a farm, very rural part of America. And my mother, even more proud of my mother, she worked in the farm, raised 4 kids, toiled and suffered. And then when we all went to college, she didn't have to work in the farm anymore, and she decided to re-pursue her passion when she was growing up as a young woman in Nara-ken, which is tea ceremony, urasenke. So she is a urasenke no sensei in the Monterey Bay area, and really just trying to, I guess, leave behind a bit of a legacy of Japanese culture, which unfortunately seems to be dying out in parts of the world. So that's kind of my background. Before I launch into the presentation, though, so it is by complete serendipity that I am here, that I have been working in the Japanese stock market. I came right out of graduate school. Some of you know my husband, Jesper Cole. You can blame everything on Jesper because we fell in love somewhere between my 2 years of grad school. I came back here to be with him. I had to find work. And so I interviewed at Sony, consulting companies, and finance was frankly the bottom of my list until somebody said, oh, you don't have to be a trader or an investment banker. There's something called research. And I said, oh, I like to speak my mind. I like to write. And so here I am. I started my job in 1990. So anybody who remembers what the Nikkei 225 index was in 1990? Not quite, but high. 38,915. We're now about 20,000, okay? So of course I start my career, I'm very excited about starting my career as a equity strategist in Japan, and I start right at the peak, and it's downhill from there. And so, as you can imagine, somebody like me, my job every day is to do what? Is to try to provide some reasonably sounding advice to our clients who are in Japan, mostly the big institutions, everybody from Mitsubishi Trust Bank, Daiwa Asset Management, Nippon Life, and then overseas, Fidelity, Capital, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, and the like. But as the market's crashing like 1,000, it seemed a day, it was very hard to stay mildly optimistic about anything, right? The debt burden was growing taller than Mount Fuji. the demographic crisis was just beginning, but clearly was proceeding with rapid fire pace. So I've had a lot of time, you can give me one credit, I've had a lot of time to think about what needs to be done, and particularly because I'm focused on the equity market here. I've been spending most of my research time, not on Womenomics, by the way, but on corporate Japan, and how can we make the corporate sector here become more competitive. Because we all know there's a lot of talent, there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of brilliant human capital, but what's happening to it? How is it surfacing or manifesting itself? So what I do first, because a lot of people ask, and I'm bombarded by people who, frankly, because it's been the right thing to do to be what? A bear on Japan for 25 years. I even have clients I was in New York recently, and I said, you know, I really think you have to increase your exposure to Japanese equities because the market's going to be very strong. And the guy looked at me, and I've known this guy for like 20 years. He said, Kathy, you know me. And you know what? The reason I still have my job is because I've been underweight Japan for 20 years. You're telling me to overweight Japan? That's career risk for me, right? And so I hear this and I see this in many different aspects, not just in my job but elsewhere. But my job is to try to use objective, transparent data to prove or disprove things. So the first thing I want to talk about, because I'm on the camp, obviously because I've used this title, that I think contrary to a lot of perceptions out there that there is absolutely nothing happening with Abenomics, especially that third arrow, I want to present to you some areas where I think there actually has been invisible progress. But before I do that, just to look at the data. So Abe came to power when? December 2012. What's happened? Well, obviously, arrow number one was quantitative easing by the Bank of Japan. And you've seen the yen-dollar rate. I know my company is dollar-based. It's cost here. I'm sure many of you are too. And that's clearly reversed the direction of the currency, a 44% depreciation since then. GDP, it's kind of hard to tell because the data is always very confusing and it's only quarterly. What's been the aggregate increase or decrease? We've seen an aggregate increase in the size of Japan's economy by almost 6%. Many of you know if you're trying to recruit anybody, which is my job as well, in Japan it's very hard to find people. Why? Because the unemployment is a record low of 3.3%. More importantly, the so-called job offers to applicants ratio, in other words, how many jobs are available versus how many people seeking work, is 1.2. That means there are 20% more jobs available in this country than Japanese people looking for work. Closer to the corporate sector, return on equity has increased by 3 points. And importantly, at the bottom, the Nikkei index has actually doubled. So that's just some of the statistics, which I think are pretty transparent. Let me just some of the areas of progress. And I have limited time, so I'll just go through some of the areas that I think have seen, at least from my vantage point, some of the most progress, at least so far. I'm not, of course, claiming that everything on that homework list has been accomplished. There's certainly areas that still need a lot more work, but let me just focus on some of the areas where I think there has been some success. Probably the biggest from my vantage point, because remember I focus on corporates here in Japan, is corporate governance. And I've been working on this topic maybe for 15 plus years. I actually ranked many years ago Japanese listed companies on various governance metrics like board independence. Do they have poison pills in place? What is their executive compensation structure like? And of course, some of my colleagues said, don't do this because we're going to get a lot of nasty phone calls from CEOs, and we did get some nasty phone calls. But my whole point was to try to explain to people that in this globalizing world, a lot of Japanese companies, as we know, often claimed in the past that Japan had its own unique mode of governance. And that unique mode of governance led to some very successful Japanese companies' performance over the years, and it didn't really have to change. However, from my vantage point, I saw a slightly different picture, that there probably was a need for increased transparency, disclosure, and putting the shareholder not toward the bottom of the totem pole, but a little bit higher. And you remember in a few years back when the so-called activists, the real aggressive activists like the Murakami Fund, whose daughter apparently is back, by the way, Steel Partners, the Children's Investment Fund. Frankly speaking, most of these funds, who I know very well, came and essentially left because they wanted to improve governance, but they were not successful. And the government didn't help because they sort of pushed back and said, you know, again, Japan is unique. It doesn't need this kind of governance. Our governance standards are fine. Thank you very much. But what's happened under Abe? Complete change in one simple matter, and that is, this is the first time the Japanese government, in my view, is admitting that its governance standards need some work. That's huge, in my opinion. And so all of a sudden we have things like a new stock index called the JPX 400 index. Some of you are familiar with this, but this is a new index developed by the stock exchange and the Nikkei newspaper that selects companies based on their performance criteria, like ROE, like governance metrics. And it was funny because only 400 companies were included. So if you're in a sector where your competitor got included and you did not, oh my God, the conversations we were hearing was, Shacho, the Shacho would say to his Nande oretachi ga haranakatta? You know, why didn't we get in and why did they get in? Oh, Shacho, has something to do with ROE. What's that? You know. And you're laughing, but I am dead serious. This is verbatim, the quotes we are hearing from some of the companies. Second is very, very importantly, a stewardship code. What is a stewardship code? This applies to asset managers, the institutions who are managing people's pension money, mutual fund money, and government, right? There is no such thing in America. We have something called ERISA, right? It's kind of a code of behavior for all asset managers. There is no such code like this in Japan until last, 2014, until last year when they adopted this stewardship code. And in very interesting fashion, they copied the model, which is a voluntary model. Comply or explain. Opt in or opt out, but if you opt out, you have to explain why you're opting out. And the stewardship code, if you comply with it, means that you have to engage with your investee companies. So if you invest in Toyota, but you never meet with them, you never ask them difficult questions, you're not really engaging, right? And this requires these asset managers to start asking questions and probing. And this has been, for my clients here in Japan, absolutely revolutionary. Not that they never did this before, but now there's much more, focus and scrutiny on the degree to which they're engaging as well as voting their shares in the best interests of their end beneficiaries, i.e. the pensioners or the investors whose money they're managing. The other thing that is a huge deal on the bottom is the corporate governance code. This quite baffled me forever because Japan has a corporate governance code. Japan has never had a code of behavior to dictate how companies, listed companies, should behave until this year, 2015. This is pretty remarkable. And importantly, in this new code, it includes things like board independence, right? A lot of Japanese boards, now today they have a lot of them have one outside director, but usually it's about one, and not always independent. The second, the bigger deal with the code is it is now requiring that if you own mochiai kabu, cross-held shares, you are required to explain the economic rationale for why you own these stocks. And I don't know if any of you talk with managements of the Japanese mega banks, they are so eager to dump this stuff, you would not believe. But having that conversation with the counterpart and say, onegaishimasu, let's unwind this relationship, it's not that easy. But now the government is saying, unless you can explain the economic rationale, you have to unwind. And I don't know, any of you know economic history, like in Germany, in the 1990s, under the Schroeder regime, remember Germany used to be a spider web also of cross-shareholdings. Daimler, Deutsche Bank, Volkswagen, they all owned shares in one another. And then EU, European Union integration, was on the horizon. So the government of Germany said to all these corporates and financial institutions, you should unwind. They actually had a carrot of capital gains tax break to encourage the dissolution of cross holdings. And what happened in Germany, interestingly, you had unwind pretty rapid of cross holdings in Germany. At that time, Germany did not have much of an M&A market. M&A exploded because, as you can imagine, if you had a stable shareholder propping up your share price, stable shareholder disappeared, your stock price would decline, and all of a sudden you became vulnerable to a takeover, right? So if you became vulnerable to a takeover, you didn't want to get taken out, you probably had to try to do something to raise your share price, which try to do something to boost shareholder ROE and the like. And all of a sudden the German stock market, which was kind of sleepy for years, started to rally. And interestingly, I looked back at German household financial assets back then. They had less in equities then than households have today. I mean, totemo very, very, very risk averse. But all of a sudden, when the DAX index was soaring and Bunds, the sovereign debt at the time, was yielding nothing, German households all of a sudden discovered equities. And this is the story I remember telling Shiozaki sensei many, many years ago. Of course, there were with Japan and Germany then, but I think you could kickstart a similar sort of process. And what we've seen here is on the right is, Japan Inc. or the corporates have a ton of cash. I skipped over how much. Anyway, a lot of money, sitting and yielding zero. And the first kind of jerk reaction from the corporate governance code, from the stewardship code, has been for companies to give back some of their excess to the shareholder in the form of share buybacks and dividends. And that's what you see on the right there. Some of this is our forecast, but you've seen record levels of returns back to shareholders. And this, to me, is very exciting. We're still where we need to be, but we're definitely on a good uptrend. Some of you working in M&A feel this every day, but M&A has also begun to pick up. Somebody just asked me a few minutes ago, what do I think about the Nikkei's purchase of the FT? We can leave that for our Q&A. But anyway, inbound, particularly outbound M&A, of course, has been leading the charge. I will skip on, and this is just a graph showing you what happened in Germany in terms of the M&A activity and what happened with mutual fund / equity investment on the right. Again, governance reforms driving the beginning of an equity culture. So governance reforms, I think, is probably, in my book, the #1 clearest example of progress vis-a-vis Abenomics. The second area, which I think has gotten much, much less focus, is fiscal reform. Because after all, why are we trying to do all this? Generate inflation. Why are we trying to grow the economy? Isn't it because Japan has one of the largest debt to GDP ratios in the world? But how do you actually specifically go about doing this? Especially when you look at the chart on the right. This is a comparison of total tax revenues, income tax, Shohizei consumption tax, percentage relative to GDP or size. Look at Japan's bar. Now, this is a little bit old, so acknowledge that, but it's very low. But we all know, living here, tax rates here aren't low, are they? We have some of the highest individual corporate tax rates in the developed world. So there's something wrong with this picture, isn't there? What is it? Evasion. Yes. So, well, part of it is corporate Japan. Ministry of Finance statistics show that 70%, of Japanese companies do not pay any tax. And most of these, of course, are SMEs. But at the individual level, know this, I assume, but many people outside Japan do not know that Japan does not have a taxpayer ID system. But that's going to change, right? We're going to see a mine number system. I actually had with Kato Katsunobu sensei yesterday from the Jiminto. He said it's going to be starting this October, so in a few months. I think the numbers will be assigned, or the whole system will get running next April. And this to me is huge. Why? Because if you do not have a number, it's kind of hard to track people, isn't it? Right? If you're a salaried person, it's hard to cheat because your tax is withheld at source. But if you're independent, consultant, self-employed, doctor, whatever, it's very hard for the government to track. So trying to recoup or make more efficient your tax collection system. I admit this is going to take years. It's not going to happen overnight, but at least it's a start. But number two, you also ability online to track people's, income information. You could also ask the banks and the insurance companies and the brokerage for their customers' number with your number in the system and assess wealth, right? Your capital gains, maybe even your property assets. So all of a sudden you go from today knowing virtually nothing about an individual to knowing a lot more. I see some worried faces in the room. I'm talking generically here. So couldn't you say, well, let's take an example. Son-san, CEO of SoftBank. Son is eligible to receive a state pension when he retires, right? Son-san, if he goes to a Japanese byoin for a backache, what does he pay out of pocket? Max 10, 20%, like everybody else. In other words, there's no means testing, is there, for entitlements. And this number system, I think, will give the government the ability to start doing this, i.e. collect more revenues and cut excessive expenditures. Now, obviously, Mr. Abe is not loudly about this point, right? Because it doesn't win votes. But to me, this is the obvious direction. And I'm actually serving on a cabinet office committee where we're talking at length about this. They have admitted to our committee they don't want to talk too loudly about this subject. But ladies and gentlemen, the direction we are going. Again, it will take time. Enforcement is going to be a huge issue, but I think it is at least a step in the right direction. Third is the topic that a lot of people are already familiar with, and I know people in the room are as expert, if not more expert than I am on this topic, but a lot of people ask me, so have you seen any change or any improvement? There's a lot of talk, but is there any real improvement? And I guess one piece of good news, when I wrote my economics report 15 years ago, that ratio of female employment was about 56, 57%, and now it's about 65. This is between the ages of 15 and 64 who could work, who are actually working. And if I'm not mistaken, somebody from the States told me this is matching, or if not exceeding, the US right now. The US has actually been going down. So the good news is there has definitely been some absolute progress, but we still obviously have a lot of work to do, because clearly this is also counting a huge number of temporary workers. Temporary workers make up 40% of Japan's total work pool. 70% of that 40 is women. So the pay gaps are massive, right? Benefit gaps are huge. So there's still much more work to be done. But what I can say is a couple more things. One, there's a piece of legislation currently in the Diet, which is so exciting. I can't wait to see the. But if this legislation passes, and I think it probably will apply to most of your companies in this room, including Goldman Sachs, it will require that if you have at least 300 or more employees, starting next April, you will have to disclose gender diversity targets. So for example, what percentage of your managerial staff will be female by 2020, and specific and detailed action plans to reach those goals. I found it extremely shocking when I first heard about it, because I know in this country there are many individuals who are vehemently opposed to disclosure of this sort, okay? So to go from just nothing to, like, actually not just disclosing, but setting targets, to me is quite radical. And what is very encouraging, the second point I'll make on is, I've been asked all of a sudden the last 12 months to go and speak at a lot of companies, a lot of Japanese companies, foreign as well, but a lot. I've been at Hitachi, Nippon Life, trading companies. The most fun was Shimizu Kensetsu, the construction company. And of course there are ranges of, let's say, getting religion, right? Some are doing it because it looks good. It's a great thing to photograph in your CSR section of your annual report. But most of the shachos tell me they are needing to care about diversity in a way they've never done because they're running out of people. Matsui-san, we can actually recruit. This is the head of Shimizu Kensetsu. We can recruit very talented female engineers, architects. They're fabulous. But after year 5 or year 7, poof, they're out the window. How do we retain? How do we promote? How do we think about flexible work arrangements? And one thing that's kind of dawned on me, and I talk about this a lot, but I am actually not so pessimistic, not just because the labor market is so tight, but because of all of your sons. In other words, I am very encouraged because I'm hearing more from males that are in the millennial generation, born between 1980s and 2000s, who are asking me how can they manage their work-life balance. Not the females, the males are increasingly asking me this question. Males at Goldman Sachs asking me this question, okay? And I think any of you who are millennials, I just think this is probably the most fascinating topic right now that one can explore. But I think this generation is going to help serve as a tailwind for diversity reforms in this country, because these young men, it's not work-life, they want life and a little bit of work, right? And they're having to, they're elderly, aging parents, oftentimes by themselves, right? So I'm hopeful that this goes from being a woman's problem and a women's issue to something that's more mainstream, and that everybody in society can eventually benefit. Very quickly, inbound tourism, everybody knows this, but this has been off the charts. This is an old graph. Remember, the government's goal was to triple inbound tourism. By the way, inbound tourism in historically, Japan was 9th out of 40 on the left for inbound tourism. About 1/10 out of France, so roughly 8 million intake per year, despite the fact, of course, all of you know, we have more Michelin-starred restaurants than France. And so that has been the goal, right, to triple inbound tourism. But look at where we are. This is last year, just over 13 million inbound tourists. Kato Sensei told us yesterday, January through June of this year, we've hit 9 million. So annualized, that's 18 million, okay? And of course, we have to thank the Chinese and other Asian tourists, because they are the biggest boost and contributor to this trend. But interestingly, after they arrive in Haneda or Narita or the Minato of Fukuoka or wherever, how much they spend is huge. It's 2 trillion yen last year. This year it's probably going to be this. Okay? We, in our research department, cover companies like Matsumoto Kiyoshi, Don Quixote, Iseta Mitsukoshi. Oh my God, their sales are just off the charts, right? Largely because of so. While Japanese sales or revenues maybe from selling, I don't know, machinery in China are not doing so well because of the slowdown there, the demand from Chinese inside this country is hitting record levels. So I think this is one goal, hitting 20 million intake of inbound tourism that will be hit earlier than their target of 2020. Last item I wanted to cover, was competitiveness. And I think maybe if you asked me a year ago, I would have said 3 of these would have been very tough. Now TPP, of course, it's in maybe more of its hands than Japan's hands at this moment, but because of the passage of TPA, it does appear that this is probably more likely than unlikely going forward. And this graph on the left, we just simulated. If Japan could conclude other free trade or EPA agreements, for example, with the EU, Korea already has one with the EU, or a broader agreement with the rest of Asia, right? Japan could actually quadruple its amount of exports under a much more freer trade regime. Upper right is agriforms. My whole family here in Japan, in Kansai, is among the biggest beneficiaries of what's going to disappear. Rice production subsidies, right? You could have a tiny, a plot the size of this table, and my relatives all get subsidies still, even though they're not full-time rice farmers. Those are going away. But more importantly, the very arcane system of JA, what's it called, Nochu, that system being essentially abolished, and a lot more control being given out to the regions in agriculture is huge in my view as well. The third area, the corporate tax rate. Interestingly, this is also old now, but we've now gone from 38%, so the effective nation 32% this year. Next year will go down to 31%, and the government's goal is to bring it below 30% within the next few years. My guess it will be 2018 when we get to below 30%. Now, again, compared to other Asian partners, it's finally putting Japan maybe on par. It's not that much lower, but at least it's a landscape than what corporate Japan has been used to in the past, and maybe might even help benefit inward FDI as well. Now, I talked a lot about things that I saw progress in. To be fair, what have I not seen much progress in? And I know the ACCJ probably has a very long list, but a couple of things. Labor market reform, things like making the labor market more mobile. I think the ACCJ, and I actually quoted this in one of my pieces, had a very good proposal to create, was it a new regular labor contract, to make it more flexible for employers to employ people on a kind of a semi-regular basis. Foreign workers. Now, this question comes up all the time. Do not call it immigration reform if you want to get an answer from the Japanese government. Ask about foreign workers and you'll get a different answer. And the government is in the process of passing legislation which will extend what they call the technical trainee program from 2 or 3 years visas to 5 years for especially construction workers from developing countries, most likely from Southeast Asia. Tokku, the special zones, apparently they say they will include foreign domestic helpers in one of those zones. I will believe it when I see it, but that's apparently on the docket as well. Other areas that still need help is new business creation, venture, right? I know there's a Silicon Valley Kakehashi Japan initiative going. Abe was apparently just enthralled when he met the head of Tesla and got to drive one of those cars. But I think there's a lot of ideas, a lot of creativity in this country, but we still need help in bringing those ideas and capital to market. So there are definitely areas that still need work. But in my book, especially because I'm coming from the vantage, having looked at Japan for a painfully long time, I can at least say the wheels are in motion. And a lot of people, because I have a lot of very, very skeptical clients around the world, again, who think that, Japan is a career breaker. I say, because they'll ask me this, and you probably get the question from your headquarters as well. I believe you. Why should I believe this time is different? Words, right, in the English language. I'll give you two reasons. One, it's, they say, Koizumi reform era, because time has passed and the problems are that much worse. But specifically, March 2011, what happened? Not only was it a terrible natural, but in one fell swoop, more importantly, Japan's dependence on nuclear power went from about 1/3 overnight. What happens then? And at the same time, remember, the Bank of Japan is pumping liquidity into the economy, driving the yen lower. So what happens to Japan's trade account? It went from the black, boom, to the red, overnight. What does that do to the current account? Current account was up here. It started to go like this. And many of you know Japanese government bonds. What are they yielding? 0.4, 0.5%. It's different from Greece that has much higher interest rates. Why? Because Japan only owes money to itself, right? Most of those bonds are owned by Japanese people. So it's okay. But it's only okay if you can maintain a current account surplus, right? But if that surplus starts to decline, the clock starts to tick, and if that goes into the red, Japan will have to start begging foreign investors to buy government bonds, you see. So this sort of reality of, oh my God, we may not be able to fund or sustain our Mount Fuji of debt, I think was wake-up call number one. Difference number two, it's pretty obvious, but is geopolitical. It's the fear factor. It's the fear of being geopolitically extremely vulnerable. And of course, a lot of commentators would say, oh, this is just Mr. Abe, very right of center, political leanings, wants to fulfill his grandfather's dream. That may all be true. But what is the number of scuffles or skirmishes, I don't know what's the term, incidents in Japan and its neighbors has skyrocketed in the last 2 or 3 years. And so how are you going to possibly defend yourself if your economy is in a coma? If your economy is in deflation? Kind of hard. You could bark like a dog, but you can never really bite, right? So that is the second factor that I think is quite different this time than in the Koizumi regime. Doesn't, of course, guarantee any success, right? But I just think has upped the ante with respect to the sense of crisis and urgency. Absolutely, what the Bank of Japan is doing is highly, highly risky. How are we going to exit this massive amount of quantitative easing? Nobody really knows because nobody's ever done it, right? It's very risky. But I think the alternative, which was to stay stuck in deflation with an aging society, with a mountain of debt, that was also really no option, right? And just to close, of course, the last thing is the risk. To me, number one, of course, there's a lot of risks outside of Japan, but inside Japan, it is the support rate. And of course, this is old. We all know it's now below 40%, depending on the surveys that you look at. And it's a tricky season because not only do we have the constitutional reinterpretation debate that is, of course, going on at present. I like to show this graph because clients of mine just don't have any idea what's happened to Japan's defense budget, but there it is. It's the only country whose defense budget has shrunk. This is the bottom line. Russia, sixfold. China, almost fourfold. Korea has almost doubled its defense budget since 2004 in the last decade. And the other controversial topic number 2, of course, is restarting nuclear, right? Our analyst on the left, this is his prediction. He thinks that the Sendai nuclear plants in Kyushu will start up again sometime in the next couple of months before the end of this year. And as we all know, this is also a very divisive topic domestically, and this could also hurt his poll numbers, right? But I will tell you, Kato Sensei yesterday and others in the cabinet have told me this is no surprise. They knew the debate about nuclear, the debate about the Constitution would cost them some support points, right? But they hopefully will kind of, after the diet ends at the end of September, move back to a focus on the economy. Good news is corporates are making record profits, which means they can invest, which means they can pay their staff, because if you don't pay, they're not going to come and stay. So hopefully we'll start to see a more virtuous cycle of Abenomics in the real economy, with consumption and capital spending driving growth going forward. Okay, I will leave it there. I'm sure there are questions in the audience, so thank you very much.
Okay, Kathy, thank you very much for a very stimulating and broad-ranging set of analyses on Abenomics and the prospects for Japan. I'd like to open this up now for Q&A, and after I do, I'm going to turn the mic back over to you, since we only got one mic here, and ask you to go ahead and take the questions. I am going to take the prerogative of the chair, though, to ask the first question, which is one of the objectives of Abenomics is clearly to stimulate domestic consumption. And Abe famously been job-owning the employers as well, I guess, as the unions, to push for higher wages. And it's had at least a certain effect, but clearly it hasn't succeeded in lifting consumption domestically to where arguably it really needs to be. And I think we see how that's hurt Japan over the last quarter or so in a situation in which China has also been going downhill, and Europe as well hasn't been terribly strong, nor the U.S. for that matter. So what do you think Abe needs to do from going forward to try to achieve this objective?
So obviously, to complete the virtuous cycle of Abenomics, meaning get the corporate sector profitable, get that corporate sector with now a lot of money in its pockets to recycle those profits in the form of higher wages to their employees so they can consume, and et cetera, et cetera. So you're absolutely right that that's been the missing jigsaw puzzle piece of the equation. But the good news is, if any of you have been watching the spring wage negotiations, the outcome was what? That there will be an increase in base wages this year that is higher than last year. And apparently these base wage increases didn't start in April. They actually start this month, get reflected in paychecks from this month in July. Also, just I think 24 hours ago or a day and a half ago, there was finally an agreement on minimum wages, right, to increase the minimum wage level by about 18 yen, I think, and that was higher also than previous rounds of negotiations for minimum wages. So it's clear that the government knows without this, without success in boosting incomes, people Abenomics as a total failure, right? That's why he's been applying a lot of, let's call it moral suasion on corporates. But again, I think what's working in the government's favor is what we just talked about earlier, and that is the shortages in the workforce are also acting as a tailwind to lift wages as well. And remember, we also don't have a consumption tax hike, which we had last year. So even though we had some nominal wage growth last year, the consumption tax hike from 5 to 8 wiped out, right, that nominal wage increase. So this year, no Shohei consumption tax hike. Nominal wages are growing pretty nicely. So I think the consumption data going forward is going to look pretty decent. We'll be surprised, and not just. Yes, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. Greg Story, Training. I'm wondering if your modelling looked at the prospect of a major earthquake striking Tokyo. Over the last 25 years, we've seen basically the Kansai reduce the number of headquarters located there, company headquarters to Tokyo. We see the Tokyo increasing. We see the prices of real estate going up in Tokyo, and we see basically everywhere else going backwards, more or less. So a lot of the eggs are in this one basket here. And so I've been here since 1979, expecting the big one. And it's always been the big one is a prospect for Tokyo. It hasn't happened yet. But when it does happen, in your modelling, have you looked at what the likely outcome is going to be probably in this last concentration in this one place?
Quick answer is no. We haven't done modeling, and I think it's frankly extremely difficult. You can kind of model a Hanshin or a Tohoku earthquake and what might happen in the Kanto plain. But I think it's partially because of that the government's got this very big push to regionalize, right? To push the human capital, to push companies, to encourage organizations not to concentrate in the metropolitan areas. Now, again, apparently what they call urbanization, meaning that concentration into urban centers. Japan and Korea, here's another parallel with Korea, are the highest concentration in the world right now. So both countries, we have this challenge of how to decentralize the economy. And this is Mr. Ishiba-san's whole platform right now, right? And there's a lot of politics obviously involved here, but that's, I think, one of the, it's not a total answer, but I think it will help to kind of mitigate some of those risks. But, of course, if the so-called big one hits, then, everything can go pear-shaped, like any sort of situation like that you can model. But, I think also it's not lost on anybody that the construction, that the quality and the infrastructure is also not completely prepared for something like that either. So, yeah, it would be a very negative hit, but I don't think the city would not be able to in relatively short order. But you already see, for example, like somebody was saying, property prices in like the Kamakura area after Tohoku, of course, kind of sank, because that's sort of, if there's a tsunami, that's going to be one of the areas. So of course there's differentiation already happening in terms of property values with the expectation that something like this might occur. Hi.
Very much for your presentation. It's very interesting. Just I have a question. When the people talk about Abenomics, tend to talk about the third arrow, kind of more deregulation. You talked about the corporate governance, but not so much about deregulation. I was curious why you don't just expect too much to government, or anyway kind of third arrow impact on the economy will be more limited.
Well, I think that's one area that still needs work, right? Overall deregulation, and it crosses a lot of sectors. It crosses labor. I didn't mention healthcare. I know some of you are involved in healthcare. What I hear from my friends is there's been a little bit of progress, but there's still a lot of work to do. So I think deregulation generally, and that's why they're trying to get this Toku movement going, but as far as I can tell, that's been pretty small and slow. So clearly, in my list of areas that need work going forward, right? And labor market deregulation is obviously another area. Yeah. Annie, or hi. You want to put it? I think.
You mentioned that part-timers make up 40%, and I realize that many companies, women who are married do not want to earn over a certain amount because that would then cause them to be taxed. And I know the legislation has been going on about changing that rule. What has happened to that? I haven't kept up in the news.
It's called the 1.03 million yen kabe, the wall. So if you're head of household and your spouse works, usually a she, can only earn up to 1.03 million yen annually for you, the head of household, to deduct her from your income for your income tax purposes. So that is still not passed. But Arimura Daijin, the Cabinet Office, they're all very adamant that this does get passed because they do think it's a deterrent for a lot of married women working more than a part-time job. So I'm hopeful, but I don't have any timeline. And Annie, next to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for a wonderful presentation. You mentioned about it's important for Japan to create new business. So I'm wondering, as government has any plan to create a Silicon Valley model, as you also maybe have some tax benefit systems and encourage young people to do startup entrepreneurship. As we know, this country really need more entrepreneurs and create their own business. I just kind of wondering, have governments thought about any plan to starting something like that? Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's been quite a lot of discussion about this topic. Everybody knows that, under deflation, the desire of a university graduate, what are the, employers of choice? The number one was komuin, becoming, working at the kuyakusho, not very entrepreneurial. So first thing is change the confidence, right? Getting young people to think, life is not just being a civil servant, but actually you can do something. You don't also have to be a salaryman or a salarywoman either. So the first step is raising that confidence level. And then step number two is if you have an idea, and if it's buried in some, say, academic research lab, how do you bring that from the lab out to the market, right? And breaking down the silos between academia and say VC or the private sector and things like that. I did mention the Silicon Valley Kakehashi project. So apparently when Abe went through Silicon Valley on his recent trip to the States, he was enthralled. And he said, we need more of this spirit in Japan. So what they're going to do is, I think, begin by sending young entrepreneurs from Japan to Silicon Valley, kind of implant them into that ecosystem to hopefully embed a little bit of that spirit and maybe give them some opportunities to raise VC money right there, because there's just, so much they don't know what to do with. But maybe having that become the seeds of a potential, I don't know if it's called Silicon Valley equivalent in Japan, but hopefully help start for more entrepreneur development in Japan in the future. But it's been, frankly, very vague, a lot of discussion, not a lot of concrete steps so far. Frank?
Frank Packard, AAA Partners, Japan. My sense in America is that a lot of the VC communities have sprung up, whether it's Boston or Austin, Texas, or Silicon Valley or Seattle, without a lot of government direction. In fact, there's been a synergy between academic resources, and I wonder to what extent there's needing, if Abe wants to succeed, there needs regulation of some of the universities and the ability to participate in business and the abilities for people to have patents. I mean, the Google or the Apple model of a garage is often people that left Stanford. And I wonder to what extent the university and the Mombugakusho is less a part of the solution than ...
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I agree that maybe something the government or the society should be thinking about. But I think right now the priority vis-a-vis academia right now is it Shimomura Daijin, the Minister of Education or whatever, is trying first level up the entire university system, as you know, so trying to create what they call super global daigaku, so universities in Japan that are truly competitive at a global level, whether it's patents, whether it's research papers, developments, things like that. And then I think once they sort of achieve maybe, I don't know what you call it, restructuring or reform of the university system at large, then I think they can go down that path of, okay, what do we do with all this brilliant knowledge and technology that is bubbling up, from this new, more competitive. But, I think that's a step away from what they're really focused on right now. Back there.
Leanne from InWorld. Thank you, Kathy. With the labor issue, I agree that more foreign workers could help with the issue here in Japan, but language in Japan, a lot of companies don't hire foreign workers who don't speak Japanese fluently, even if they have the right skills. Is the government doing anything about that? How is the government encouraging corporates based on purely skills and not language issues?
I don't much initiative in the government saying to companies, you must speak English because these employees or potential employees do not speak Japanese. But I think we're already seeing organically, whether it's SoftBank or Uniqlo. There was another Japanese company recently who did it, that changed their company language to English. They're doing it not because it's a good thing to do, it's because they have to, because they're becoming much more global, by nature. So I suspect at this point, I haven't heard any initiative from the government going into sort of almost intervening at the private sector level saying, if you really want to boost non-Japanese employment, you got to change your company language or given any incentives to do so. But I think it will probably happen more organically at this point. And what I talked about earlier in terms of the technical assistance, I think the big areas of foreign workers that will open up is construction, is nursing care, kind of the first and most needy, type areas. And even though they don't call it immigration reform, I mean, look at countries around the world, right, where your native population used to do the, sweeping of the platforms or cleaning of the bathrooms. Then over time, your native population doesn't want to do those jobs anymore. They have other choices, right? That's exactly, I think, where we are here in Japan. Go to any konbini. Who's taking your money behind the cash register? In my neighborhood, 9 out of 10, it's not a Japanese person, right? It's a non-Japanese person because they're the ones they're students studying at Japanese universities who can do arubaito and don't mind working at 2 a.m., right? And I think that's just going to be the natural course of evolution for the country. But if anybody's expecting them to have a bells and whistles campaign, we're going to open the floodgates to immigrants and let them stay forever, I think you're wishing for the impossible, at least right now. I think that will take a long, long time.
Paul Hunter from the International Bankers Association. One area about labour market reform where the government has it in its own control is its own bureaucrats. And we've just gone through the annual Jinji-Edo, and we have 90% practically turnover of staff with in the Ministry of Finance or the FSA, and we obviously have the seniority rule where they get rid of people or downgrade their salaries when they reach a certain age. Is there any prospect of the normalizing the sort of labour market within the government sector and doing away with some of the sort of the Amakadari situation where we get sort of forbearance because they're pulling out these people into other sectors?
Not that Abe was the first government to introduce a post in the cabinet office. This is basically called the Jinji Tanto, and that's actually Kato Katsunobu's second job. He's in charge of kind of personnel or overseeing very high-level personnel assignments in a whole variety of bureaucracies. And I don't know if you saw, because I follow diversity topics, number of female, I guess it's kambucho ijo, so I don't know what the English equivalent, but senior ranked female bureaucratic leaders was 16, 1-6, okay, in the whole government 2 years ago, 30. Okay, it's still 30, not 300, but this was a deliberate move by the Abe regime. And some of the positions apparently were untraditional routes. So one woman, she'd only been in a post 1 year. That post is typically a 2-year post. Nobody ever moves before 2 years, and they just cracked that law. and made that change. So I'm not familiar with other of the personnel changes, and I think still there's going to be this rotation no matter what. But I think in certain circumstances, if they see a person with a certain skill set or knowledge base, like look at Mr. Mori, right, in FSA, he came from New York. This guy is he lives and breathes corporate governance reform. I think, thank God, somebody like him, I don't know if he was fast-tracked to the top, but he certainly had a lot of influence in some of the reforms that I just discussed today. And you can be sure there was a huge amount of opposition to promoting somebody like that, right, within corporate Japan. So it's not, dramatic shifts, I think, in the personnel, management system, but I think there's some tweaking going on in a very deliberate fashion. Yep.
Eric Sedlak from Jones Day. I wanted to ask, a lot of the incentives towards using the retained earnings to do tax and dividends and so forth are obviously very positive for the market and positive for the Japanese companies. In the long term, do you think that enough Japanese companies are going to be reinvesting in Japan in R&D and CapEx and so forth, that 5 or 10 years from now, the Japanese companies will still have strong presences in the Japanese market in the technical skills area, managerial jobs, and so forth?
Yeah, so I think what's happened is because a lot of these governance reforms that triggered that behavior have been so sudden. Japan is such a wonderful place. Everybody says, "Oh, Kathy, Japan never changes," or so slow to change. I said, "No, you're absolutely wrong. It's decide to change. But once it makes a decision to change, don't blink, right? It's very fast." And in this instance, that chart I showed you on share buybacks and dividends was exactly that. So one company does a massive share buyback. The share price went up 21% in 2 days. The competitors look like, oh my God, we got to do the same thing, right? So it was a knee-jerk response to this phenomenon. But the obvious question, which I think you're alluding to, which is that the only use of cash, right? If you're a growth company, shouldn't you be retaining that cash, waiting for an exciting M&A acquisition opportunity, or waiting for some CapEx, opportunity to develop your technology even further? Some companies are doing that, so that very thoughtful process of, let's think about it. Our options are sit on the cash, give it back to shareholders, spend it on CapEx, spend it on M&A. And if all those other options, if the the first, third, and fourth are not viable, then okay, we don't have any growth opportunities, so we should give it back. That's a thoughtful process of decision making. But I think a lot of the moves that we've seen in the market so far have been very reactive, right? Everybody else is doing it, so we've got to do it too. But wait a minute, you're in the electronic component space or something that's more growthy. You should not be giving all your cash back, should you, right? So now I think we're in that second stage of evolution, that companies are having a second thought about what's the optimal use of that cash. Maybe.
Thank you. This is Andy Joyce from MetLife. A lot of companies are investing overseas M&A, and I think part of the reason why they're doing that is chasing the ROE that you mentioned in your presentation. But Japanese companies have a bit of a track record over the years for destroying value in their M&A activity. So I'm just wondering, is there anything from your perspective you think this time is different in this current M&A wave in terms of Japanese companies' abilities to grow value from their overseas acquisitions? And also, sorry, one more. Yep. What do you think of the Nikkei's purchase of the FT?
So you're absolutely right that the track record is not been stellar. Maybe that's an understatement. I think there are a whole variety of reasons why that track record has been the way it is. But at the very minimum, I think it has shifted a bit more to strategic M&A as opposed to, I just got to grab something because my competitor's grabbing something and I need to show that I'm active in this arena. So I think it's more strategic. Having said that, you also point out that if it's what is the end game? Is the end game the acquisition, or is the end game actually creating an value from that acquisition to your overall organization? And I think a lot of companies still kind of view M&A as the end goal, as opposed to a means to a goal. Yeah, so I'm not saying that there's going to be a huge amount of success. I'm just saying I think that the way the companies are thinking about M&A is a little bit different from in the past. And, you know, I sit in a company that a lot of advisory work in this field. Of course, so there's a big Chinese wall between me and the bankers, so I don't know much. But what I'm told is that the corporates, the Japanese corporates, are asking us for help. It used to be almost exclusively emerging markets and exclusively emerging Asia. I don't know if any of you have been watching what's been happening in places like Thailand recently. It's kind of scary. There's been a decided shift, therefore, back to places like North America. Kind of, you know, devil you know better than devil you know. Not that everything is going to go into development, but it used to be almost entirely emerging market related, is now broadening back to the developed market sphere, which is, I think, kind of an interesting trend. And on your second question, I have no real value-added comments to make. All I will say is, of course, everybody who about this, they say, oh, Nikkei is just going to destroy every newspaper, you know, in the world. Yeah, but at the same time, you know, Nikkei, think about if you're Pearson and if you had to find a buyer, wouldn't you want that buyer to kind of A, leave you alone, B, be only in kind of journalism, not in 15 other businesses. So, you know, this doesn't mean or guarantee that they're going to succeed, but I have a strong feeling they're not much. Because why would you do that with such a, in my opinion, one of the best quality, you know, newspapers out there. But clearly on the digital front, they have a long way to go. But Nikkei also has, you know, it's not like they're tiny. And they're just swimming in cash as well, right? So for them, it seemed like a good fit. I admit the price tag does look very steep, right? But they're not a listed company, so they can do with their money whatever they feel like it. But I'm not so overly concerned. I hope that they'll respect the FT's editorial independence. Was there one more question out here I missed? Sorry. Wait, behind you.
This is Matsuo Kawabata from Mori Buildings. So, in your explanations, until 2019, we have the rugby football World Cup in Tokyo and 2020 Olympics. And the topics are only focused on to the new arena at this moment. But it's one shot of the investment costs about 250 billion yen. So that's as much as the Roppongi Hills. The huge investment is required for one arena. So what do you think about the acceptance of the Olympics or rugby football, such a world-scale event in Japan? I mean, we are not accepting many guests. For example, the hotels are fully occupied at this moment already by Chinese tourism. And also the construction cost raised up about 100% by the Tohoku's restructuring. So what do you think about the real thing?
Well, I don't even know if I can answer this because it's already a done deal. Unless you want to give the Olympics back to somebody else. You're going to have to increase your capacity of hotels. You're going to have to increase you know, whatever the venue capacity to house the various events. Of course, there's an argument of at what price, right? Do these new facilities need to be built, and what are you going to do with the facilities after the Olympics are over and the rugby games are over? But I think there's absolutely no way to say, oh, sorry, you know, we do it, but now we can't. I think that would be a total loss of face, and so I think it's going to happen. There will be costs involved that were not, you know, previously forecast, but hopefully, you know, even more people who never really were interested in Japan will discover Japan, right? And it's a fantastic opportunity. I'm also sitting on a separate committee. This is not, but we're working on 2020 legacy, environmental issues, technology issues. I'm on the economy sort of thread, where we're trying to figure out ways, how can we leave a good legacy, right, in all of these spheres past 2020, right? Because it's a real showcase opportunity. Observers think, well, the economy is going to be fine until 2020 and then it's right? That's a common observation of many people. So we don't want that to happen. I don't think any of us want this to happen in this room. So what can we do to ensure growth sustainability? Okay.
At the end of the luncheon, time is up. I want to thank you so much for that very stimulating and thoughtful presentation. So.